So you said earlier that China has the ability to and does play the long game.
Yeah.
Even to the point where the leader says, it's not just about my term in office, I'm happy to invest in whoever comes after me. And that's whatever we think of China as a nation and its culture and so on, that's a very powerful thing to be able to do. So China is playing around in other parts of the world. Mm-hmm. It's not in the news. You don't see it in the news at all. They've got a whole series of disputes going on with India.
Yep.
And they're playing a sort of a game. There's little bits of territory that altogether don't make much up in terms of acreage, but nonetheless they apparently have got some strategic value to China, and it's a way of annoying India, and it's a way. I think there's one area from memory that I think it's called the dagger or something, and if that's blocked off, then India can't get to another part if it ever wants to defend itself. So, what's your take on what is in China's mind when it plays these little games that on the surface don't seem to mean much?
Yeah. China's playing a very clever game and a very long game. I liken it to eating an elephant. Our politicians, because they're having to react on what's going to be in tomorrow morning's headlines, that's the elephant. They're having to swallow whole elephants several times a week. The Chinese are going, we need to eat the elephants. We're going to eat a little nibble at a time. And we're going to take 10 years to eat the elephant. And they'll achieve what they need to. What are they trying to do? What drives China? It's economics, economics, and economics. They want to be the world's economic superpower. They recognise that they need a military capability because they feel threatened and everything else. They've got the disputes with India up in the northern Himalayan border with India. That leads to regular fights. Now, it's physical fights between their soldiers. They haven't started quite shooting at each other, but there's that animosity that's there. China's got a lot of internal issues that it's having to focus on and everything else. It's got historical issues with Japan and everywhere else. But everything that's driving it is its desire to grow from an economic perspective and its desire to maintain or to develop and keep that one China concept that is recognised. So that's why we hear the focus on Taiwan. I'll park Taiwan for the moment. China's got, in its economic growth across the world, its Belt and Road Initiative. And therefore, it's bought most of Africa. It's put huge amounts of infrastructure across Africa, railways, roads, built ports, controls a lot of the agriculture that's there, but primarily controls natural resources. So it's got access to oil, it's got access to other natural resources, but some of the most important ones are rare earth metals. Some of the mines, the commercial mines that there are in Africa, are the only commercial mines in the world to produce some of the rare earth metals that we need for all of our electronics. China owns over 90% of the mines around the world that economically are economically viable to produce these rare earth metals. They control the market in that. They've taken over a lot of Africa and they physically own big chunks of it. They're doing the same now into South America and they're growing their influence in through South America. So they're very slowly growing that political economic influence in different continents. And they don't want anything to deal with that. But the things that concern them are, Taiwan's position and Taiwan becoming increasingly independent and being seen by different countries as independent to China. No matter what people are publicly saying, they see it moving away. And China has got the historical issue with the government of Taiwan. That's who the Chinese Communist Party pushed out originally. It's the original government from China that was kicked out of Beijing by Mao Zedong and the revolution that went on, and it's a thorn in the side. But it's also economically extremely successful, and China would love to get hold of that and bring it into the success that's in it. It supplies a large proportion of microchips around the world, and that's why China's putting a lot of political pressure in there. The other thing that China wants to be able to do is control the trade routes, especially that are going through Southeast Asia, because they recognise that all the trade routes from the west go through Southeast Asia. So that's why we're seeing disputes between China and the Philippines and Vietnam and Taiwan and other countries over two sets of islands or elements of two sets of islands, the Paracel and the Spratly Islands. And what China's doing there's a 9-dash line or an 11-dash line within there, depending on whether you're looking at it from the Chinese perspective or the Taiwanese perspective, and disputes over ownership of the islands and ownership of the territories. China's being very clever here. What it's doing is it's recognizing that under international law, if you've got a shoal, so a bit of sand that may be exposed at low tide, it's got no standing under international law. It's linked to a continental shelf. But if you take that shoal and you build it up into an island and you plonk your flag in the island, and you just happen to put a few houses on it and build an airfield for the military on it and all the rest of it, it becomes territory. Well, territory, an island territory has got a status under international maritime law where you've got a 12-mile zone around and a 200-mile economic zone that's around that. So China's doing that. Taiwan, Vietnam and the Philippines have recognized that as well. So they are doing that in certain places. And that's why we're seeing physical fights between Chinese coast guards and fishermen and other things going on in Southeast Asia. It's a tinderbox that's going on in there. But it's all about being able to control shipping going through some of the busiest shipping lanes in the world from China through the South China Seas. And that's why we see the response coming from the West. We see the United States having freedom of navigation trips where they put their ships through there. The first ever deployment of HMS Queen Elizabeth with a NATO task force supporting it, with Dutch and German and all the rest of it, went to Southeast Asia. It didn't go into the Baltic or it didn't go into the Black Sea. It went to Southeast Asia to send a message to China that we're watching it. It's definitely the longer term threat that's there. And the whole region is such a tinderbox. And the regional players recognise it as a tinderbox, which is why we're seeing the Chinese building power projection capability because they've got a greater global influence. They've just launched the third aircraft carrier. Power projection, military terms, pick up a military capability, take it somewhere to do something. Very expensive. So you don't build it unless you're going to use it. The Indians have recognised that, so they've just said that they've got 2 aircraft carriers. They've just said their ambition is to have 5 aircraft carriers. They're looking at that. The Japanese have recognised it and gone, and they've changed the constitution completely. And they've changed the constitution to allow them to take troops out of Japanese immediate interests and deploy them elsewhere. They've changed the constitution to allow them to have aircraft carriers. In the Second World War, they weren't allowed to have an aircraft carrier. So their helicopter carrier, they're now converting to be F-35B capable so they can fly aircraft off that. They've just developed a marine capability to go and take and protect Japanese island interests. Well, there's a dispute between Russia and Japan over the Kuril Islands that's been going on since the Second World War. But there's also big disputes between Japan and China over what's going on in some of the South China Seas islands. It's a tinderbox, and that's the trouble. Where's it going to go? Difficult to predict at the moment. China doesn't want a shooting war because economically it knows that would probably destroy its model at the moment. However, it may get sucked into it either because it sees an opportunity. So peace negotiations in Ukraine where territory is ceded within a short period of time, China goes, well, economically we can handle this for 3 years. That's not a problem. So they take Taiwan to try and solve a problem. Or they start shooting at the Philippines to solve a problem. The question then comes in as to whether the West would come in a way to try and protect those countries when it's focused on what's going on in Ukraine and the instability that's growing in the Middle East and everything else. So these are very difficult political decisions that countries are making. And China is in a very good position at the moment because it's just sitting back, it's just watching, it's prodding here, it's poking there, it's having a little look, and it's building up a capability and learning the lessons, whether they be political lessons, economic lessons, or military lessons as to what it can do. It's watching us very, very closely indeed.
So the West, in regards to China, are we being smart enough? Yes or no?
No. Simple. If I was to grade the threats across the globe at the moment, our immediate threat is the war in Europe, Russia, Ukraine. Our immediate and slightly plus threat is what's going on in the Middle East and increased destabilization in the Middle East if Iran gets the wherewithal to try and expand that into regional conflict. Our medium-term to longer-term threat, and this will go on even after Ukraine and the Middle East is sorted, if they could ever be sorted, is China and China's influence. The region is a tinderbox.
Again, not reason to pursue it too long, but there is a view that the more one considers China as an enemy, that it adopts that persona. Because I'm just playing devil's advocate a bit here, that, there is, as you said, it doesn't look likely that China wants a shooting war. Its whole model is based on economic prosperity. Yeah. So sometimes the rhetoric, when you listen particularly from the US, tends to be
aggressive.
And you do wonder whether, because there's almost as well, America has been the world superpower. Mm-hmm. If you look at the various graphs now, China will, not might, will overtake it.
Yes.
And there's a sense that America hasn't yet reconciled that fact.
Yeah.
How much do you think that's playing into? Because it's quite serious. If we create this enemy, we have to be prepared to fight it.
Oh, this is almost not a complete podcast. You come down to the psychology of thinking, and you come down to the understanding that warfare is diplomacy by other means, and warfare is whenever the politics and the diplomacy has failed. But militaries are an arm of diplomacy. So when a country has failed to negotiate, to get economic agreements, to get something else, and their competitor, I'll use the word competitor, tries to take excessive advantage, that country has to make a decision as to whether they're going to slap them back militarily and then get into negotiation and all the rest of it, or whether they're going to let them take that advantage and then take more of an advantage and take more of an advantage. And that's where the military comes in. The difference between China being a competitor and China being an enemy is in language, because, and that's why you keep your friends close, but you keep your enemies closer. That's why politically and economically, the right thing for the West to do is keep China as close as is physically possible, recognizing that, China as a competitor is trying to gain economic advantage. Who's it trying to gain economic advantage over? You. And therefore, that's where the competition comes in. Once that economic advantage translates into a direct threat to your national interests, that's where it goes from being competitor to being enemy. And we're seeing that in some areas at the moment, and that being backed up from an aggressive perspective. And that the trouble is, you then get onto the escalation ladder. So one side gets aggressive and gets their big stick. The other side goes, "Ooh, they've got a big stick. Best we get a bigger stick." Then that side sees they've got a bigger stick and gets something else. And unless you have a mechanism to stop that, and this is where the United Nations is impotent in doing that, it's the body that should be doing it. Diplomacy so far has worked. In nuclear terms, mutually assured destruction has worked because people recognize that actually both sides have got the biggest stick you can possibly get, because it'll destroy everyone, not just each other. But there's always a danger at lower level conflicts.
Yeah, and again, as you say, this is definitely one for another, because you said as nuclear, but in reality, we've now seen Russia, we never envisaged Russia using a nuclear shield to then attack somebody who's not a nuclear power. Yeah. And the vast majority of the world is not a nuclear power. Yeah, exactly. And the danger is. Anyway, on that note, Phil, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
We'll definitely be inviting you back because there's so much more to talk about. But thanks for your time this afternoon.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.